January 11, 1942, 326 nautical miles east of Boston. A British freighter called the Cyclops, more than 9,000 tons of steel loaded with cargo bound for the war effort, is sliced open by a torpedo she never saw coming. No periscope wake. No warning at all. The submarine that killed her, U-123, isn't hiding beneath the waves at all. It's sitting on the surface, running on its diesel engines in the dark, close enough to watch the ship burn. This is the opening shot of a campaign that will sink more American tonnage in 6 months than the United States Navy can comfortably admit to its own public. And the reason it worked is a tactic so simple it barely sounds like a tactic at all. To understand how German submarines could operate this openly, this close to the American coast without being detected, you have to understand what Allied technology could actually see, and more importantly, what it couldn't. Here's the hinge this entire story turns on. By 1942, the Royal Navy, and following behind them, the United States Navy, had built their entire anti-submarine strategy around a device called ASDIC, what the Americans would later call sonar. It worked by sending a directional pulse of sound through the water and listening for the echo that bounced back off a submerged object. It was a genuine technological achievement, and on paper, it should have made the ocean a very dangerous place for any submarine trying to hide beneath the surface. Notice the specific wording in that sentence, beneath the surface, because ASDIC's entire method of detection depended on sound traveling through water, bouncing off a hull, and returning to a receiver. If a U-boat wasn't underwater in the first place, there was nothing for that sound pulse to find. A submarine running on the surface, at night, its low silhouette barely breaking the waterline, was functionally invisible to a detection system built specifically to hunt it beneath the sea. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine submarine arm, understood this gap in Allied technology with total clarity, and he built his entire operational doctrine around exploiting it. He instructed his U-boat captains to attack primarily on the surface, and primarily at night, turning the one advantage the ocean offered them, darkness, into a weapon every bit as important as their torpedoes. A U-boat running on the surface could move faster than it ever could submerged, using its diesel engines instead of its far slower electric motors, giving commanders the speed to maneuver into position, line up a shot, and slip away again before an escort vessel even understood what had happened. Think about what this meant for the men on merchant ships crossing the Atlantic, or later, hugging the American coastline. Every lookout on every ship had been trained, implicitly, to think of the submarine threat as something beneath them, a shape in the depths, a wake from a periscope, a shadow under the waves. The actual threat was often sitting right on the surface of the water alongside them, indistinguishable in the dark from a low wave or a piece of driftwood, until the moment its torpedo tubes fired. This wasn't an isolated trick used once and abandoned. It became the default doctrine of the entire U-boat arm for years, because it worked so consistently that German commanders had little reason to change it. Naval historians studying the ASDIC system after the war noted something almost embarrassing in hindsight. The fact that most submarine attacks were actually happening on the surface, where sonar was completely irrelevant, wasn't fully accounted for in how the Allies built their early war defenses. The Allies had built an extraordinarily sophisticated tool for solving a problem that, for long stretches of the war, wasn't the problem actually being posed to them. And the numbers from the war's opening years bear this out with brutal clarity. During the first full year of the German offensive against Britain, roughly 1,200 vessels were sent to the bottom, an average of about 80 ships every single month. The following year, 1941, saw another 1,118 ships lost, climbing to an average of 93 a month. Many of these sinkings happened within sight of the coastlines they were supposed to be protected by, a detail that made the failure impossible to hide from the sailors and coastal communities watching it happen. This was the environment American commanders inherited when the United States entered the war in December. 1941. An enemy that had already spent 2 years perfecting a tactic the Allies' best underwater detection technology was structurally incapable of countering. What made this doctrine especially dangerous wasn't just that it worked. It was that it worked in a way that made the eventual counter almost impossible to improvise quickly. You cannot retrofit a sound-based detection system to see through air. The gap Dönitz had identified wasn't a flaw that could be patched with a software update or a change in tactics on the Allied side alone. It required an entirely different category of technology, one that didn't yet exist in the numbers needed to close the gap, and wouldn't for some time to come. Until that technology arrived, the surface at night belonged, almost uncontested, to the U-boats. There's a deeper irony sitting inside this entire tactic, one worth pausing on before moving forward. The Allies had poured enormous scientific effort and national resources into a device that represented, by every conventional measure, genuinely superior engineering. ASDIC could locate a submerged hull with a precision no earlier generation of naval technology could have imagined. And none of that sophistication mattered in the moment that counted most, because the enemy had simply chosen not to play by the rules that sophistication assumed. Sometimes the most dangerous tactic in a war isn't the one that defeats an opponent's technology directly. It's the one that renders that technology quietly, almost politely, and completely irrelevant instead. So if you're wondering how much damage a handful of submarines could actually do with an invisible tactic and an undefended coastline, the answer is written into one of the most one-sided campaigns of the entire naval war. When Germany declared war on the United States in December 1941, Dönitz saw an opportunity most Americans didn't yet understand was coming. He codenamed it Operation Paukenschlag, Drumbeat, and the plan was simple: send his long-range U-boats directly to the American coastline, where merchant ships were still sailing alone, unescorted, often silhouetted at night against the glow of coastal cities that hadn't yet been ordered to black out their lights. Here's the number that should stop you. Dönitz initially had only 6 operational U-boats available for the entire operation, after accounting for boats deployed elsewhere and others still in dockyards for refit. 6 submarines sent against the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. And in their opening sortie alone, those 6 boats sank 87 ships, totaling over 500,000 tons of shipping. 6 submarines, 500,000 tons. That's not a rounding error in the arithmetic of a global war. That's a demonstration of just how completely undefended American coastal waters were against a tactic nobody had prepared to counter. Over the following 6 months, the campaign only widened. A total of 117 German U-boats carried out 168 patrols in North American coastal waters, stretching from Newfoundland down to the Florida Straits. By the time this phase of the offensive wound down, 240 Allied merchant vessels and escort warships had been sent to the bottom, a combined loss of 1.25 million gross registered tons of petroleum, armaments, raw materials, and food that the Allied war effort desperately needed. A parallel offensive in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico produced almost identical devastation. 234 more ships lost, another 1.12 million tons gone. More than 6,800 Allied merchant sailors, naval gunners, and civilian passengers died in the process. German submariners themselves had a name for this stretch of the war, and it wasn't a somber one. They called it the Second Happy Time, or with a kind of dark humor that says everything about how one-sided the fighting felt from their side of the periscope, the American shooting season. Over the course of this period, Axis submarines sank 609 ships totaling 3.1 million tons for the loss of only 22 U-boats in return. Do that math for a moment. 22 submarines lost in exchange for over 600 ships. That ratio wasn't an accident of luck. It was the direct, measurable dividend of a tactic the Allies' entire underwater detection system had no answer for. And it wasn't only the invisibility of the surface attack doing the damage. It was what that invisibility allowed German commanders to actually see with their own eyes. U-boat captains operating close to the American coast in these opening months reported watching entire cities glowing on the horizon at night, Miami and other coastal towns still lit up in peacetime brilliance months into a war that had already reached their own shores. Merchant ships sailing that coastline were silhouetted perfectly against those city lights, turned into obvious targets by the very illumination meant to keep daily life running normally on shore. The U-boats didn't need sophisticated targeting to find their prey. The prey was outlined against the glow of America's own unblacked-out cities. Sit with the strategic embarrassment buried inside that detail. The most technologically advanced navy in the world, backed by an industrial base capable of eventually outbuilding the entire German war machine, was for these crucial months being defeated not by superior enemy technology, but by a simple absence of blackout discipline along its own coastline, combined with a detection system that had never been designed to counter an enemy willing to fight in the open air rather than beneath the waves. The US Navy's own internal assessment of this period, written years after the war by officers who had lived through it, didn't mince words about how bad the early results actually were. Success in attacking the U-boats during this period sat at less than 5%, meaning that out of every 100 attempts to hunt down and kill a submarine, roughly 95 failed outright. 95 failures for every 5 successes, against an enemy operating in plain sight on the surface of the water, because the entire detection apparatus built to find them was, for these engagements, looking in the wrong medium entirely. This is the part of the story that turns a tactical innovation into something closer to a genuine crisis for the Allied war effort. Because ships were going down faster than American shipyards could replace them, and for a period stretching across the first half of 1942, the war at sea wasn't simply being lost in isolated engagements. It was being lost in the aggregate. The tonnage sunk each month, outpacing the tonnage launched. A strategic arithmetic that, if it had continued unchecked, threatened to strangle the flow of fuel, food and war material that the entire Allied strategy in Europe depended on. Picture what that arithmetic looked like from inside a single U-boat's control room during these months. A captain like Reinhard Hardigan, commanding U-123 on that opening patrol, wasn't fighting through elaborate evasive maneuvers or dodging depth charges dropped by escorts hunting him from above. He was simply cruising the surface after dark, selecting targets almost at leisure, torpedoing one ship and moving on to find the next, before dawn forced him back beneath the waves to avoid daylight observation. War for these opening months had briefly become something closer to target practice for one side and a helpless, undefended commute for the other. A strange, one-sided rhythm that would not last, but that felt, to the men living inside it on both sides of the periscope, as if it might never end. Do that math in your head one more time. At the scale it actually mattered to the men living through it every single day. Up to 143 ships going down in a single month during the grim spring of 1942. That's not a statistic from a textbook footnote. That's the US Navy's own later admission of just how close this campaign came to breaking the Allied supply chain across the Atlantic entirely, at the exact moment American industrial mobilization for the war was still ramping up to full strength. But here's the turning point this whole story has been building toward, and it's not a story about a single brilliant countermeasure. It's a story about two things happening at once, one technological, one industrial, that finally closed the gap the surface tactic had exploited for so long. The technological answer arrived first, and it attacked the exact weakness Dönitz had identified. If ASDIC couldn't see a U-boat running on the surface, then the Allies needed a detection system that didn't rely on sound through water at all. Radar mounted on aircraft filled precisely that gap, and the specific piece of equipment that turned radar contact into an actual kill was something almost absurdly simple in concept. A powerful searchlight called the Leigh Light, mounted beneath patrol aircraft, capable of illuminating a U-boat's position the instant radar picked it up on the surface at night. A U-boat that had spent years hiding in the one place ASDIC couldn't see it now found that same darkness stripped away by aircraft that could find it by radar and then blind its lookouts with a beam of light before it ever had the chance to dive to safety. The countermeasure that had been so effective for so long was lost the moment the Allies stopped trying to solve the problem with sound and started solving it with light. Dönitz, to his credit, didn't simply accept this loss without a fight. He ordered research into absorbent coatings and rubber hull paints designed to reduce his U-boat's ASDIC signature, hoping to buy back some of the advantage that had just been stripped away. It produced little success. He authorized the release of noise-making decoys, devices that could trick an inexperienced ASDIC operator into chasing a false contact, while the real submarine slipped away. It worked, but only against operators who hadn't yet learned to tell the difference. And Allied crews learned fast, because the second half of this turning point wasn't a piece of hardware at all. It was raw industrial output, and it belonged entirely to the United States. The U.S. Office of War Information, faced with the humiliation of Operation Drumbeat's opening months, made a deliberate strategic choice. Rather than dwelling on the defeat, it told the American media to focus public attention on the shipbuilding program instead. A bet that America could simply outbuild the damage being done to it faster than German submarines could inflict it. That bet paid off with a speed that must have startled even the people who made it. American shipyards, mass-producing Liberty ships and their faster successors on assembly line schedules that dwarfed anything German planners had accounted for, crossed a critical threshold in October 1942. New ship production finally outstripped losses to enemy action, and it never fell behind again for the remainder of the war. Picture what that crossing point actually meant on a graph, because the shape of it tells the whole story better than any single number can. Before October 1942, the line representing ships sunk sat above the line representing ships built, and every month that gap persisted was a month the Allied war machine was, quite literally, losing ground faster than it could recover it. After that month, the lines crossed permanently, and the tonnage race that German U-boats had been winning through invisibility alone became a race that raw American industrial capacity was always going to win instead. The final piece of this reversal fell into place in 1943. Combined with the radar and searchlight technology that had already stripped away the U-boat's surface invisibility, Allied convoy escorts, code-breaking intelligence and long-range aircraft coverage across the mid-Atlantic gap finally closed every remaining seam the U-boats had been operating through. The month that became known to the Kriegsmarine's own submariners as Black May saw 41 U-boats sunk in a single 31-day stretch, a loss rate no submarine service in history could sustain indefinitely. Dönitz withdrew the bulk of his force from the North Atlantic before that month had even finished. The tactic that had once made his submarines effectively invisible had, within roughly a year, become the reason so many of them were being found and destroyed, because once Allied technology could finally see the surface as clearly as it had always been able to see beneath it, there was nowhere left for a U-boat running at night to actually hide. Go back one more time to that dark stretch of ocean off the American coast in January 1942, to a submarine sitting calmly on the surface, invisible to the one detection system built specifically to find it. That single tactical insight, that sound doesn't travel through air the way it travels through water, bought Germany's U-boat fleet nearly 2 years of the most lopsided naval campaign of the entire war. It sank ships faster than shipyards could launch them, faster than escorts could protect them, faster than anyone on the Allied side fully understood was even happening until the tonnage figures made it impossible to ignore any longer. It was never really about the torpedoes. It was about a gap in what one side could see, exploited with total discipline by the other, for exactly as long as that gap remained open, and not one day longer. In the end, the ocean didn't stay silent for anyone, and the silence that had once belonged entirely to the hunters eventually became the very thing that betrayed them.